All right, here we are. World War II begins. I told you we'd get here, and here we are. Let's start by talking about sort of the transition period, going over a little bit of review. Okay, so we had the Central Powers and we had the Allies in World War I. When the Americans stepped in to back up the Allies, the Germany and the countries who made up the Central Powers were kind of forced to step back because this was an entire, whole set of fresh troops coming in and joining pretty late in the war. And so they really didn't have much of a shot. So then we, once that war was over, we did our best to set Europe back to rights, even though we did not join the League of Nations. We tried to go back to isolationism, and we tried to focus on our own economy and how to help that rebound, which led to the Roaring Twenties. But then it didn't quite totally work out, because then at the end of the 20s into the 1930s, we had the Great Depression. Okay? So America is not in the best shape at this particular point anyway, when World War II actually begins to start ramping up. So that's where we're at. We're backed up a little bit in the timeline, and so I just want you guys to understand that as we start going forward. Okay, that these things are kind of overlapping at this point. Okay. World War II begins. All right. It does not begin here in America. It, again, does not even start with us being involved. But let's see how this all comes together. Totalitarianism. That is a huge, huge long word. Let me go ahead and circle this definition for you here. A system in which the government acts as absolute ruler with complete control over every element of life. Okay? So, this is not the government sets up rules to help things work better. This is every single aspect of your life is controlled by the government. Managed on every single level, even the tiniest thing. Okay? After World War I, poverty, instability, and dissatisfaction in Europe led to the rise of totalitarian dictators who promised they could create change if only they had complete control of everything. Okay? So the idea behind this was like, look, if you will give us total control over your life, if you will not, if you would be willing to not have some of your freedoms, some of your individual liberties, and let us have control over everything, we can fix it. Okay? And it sounded good at this point. Poverty, instability, dissatisfaction, war-torn nations, homelessness, we talked about. All of this, these people who are uprooted, it sounded good. You can fix it if you just give up your freedoms. It sounded amazing, but it was not. It was not at all amazing. All right, so let's talk about Italy. Okay, Italy, big star right here. Italy had been one of the big four nations to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles, but economic failure led to chaos. Again, a downturn in the economy, people out of jobs, people not able to afford what they need to live. We talked about this cycle before. In 1922, underline that, Benito Mussolini, the leader of a fascist totalitarian movement, forced the King of Italy to grant him power. He named himself dictator under the title Il Duce. So he just called himself the leader. Okay? Fascism, let me circle this here for you. This is a form of totalitarianism specifically started under his name, Mussolini, emphasizing nationalism and conformity. Okay, so it's not just that Mussolini was in control of absolutely everything, like totalitarianism means. It's that He is in control of everything. Also, we are going to emphasize that Italy should be the best and the strongest. We're going to focus on that, the nationalism part of this, and also conformity. Everybody should be the same. Everybody should get the same things, etc., etc. Everybody should fall in line. Okay? So as we go through this, you're going to see lots of different examples of these sorts of things. Let's talk about the first little blue box here up at the top. I'm going to adjust this image. There we go. The USSR formed in 1922. I'm going to underline that if I can. That's really small. When the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, that is a mouthful. Let's try that one more time. Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic united with 3 smaller Soviet republics. Okay, so the USSR here is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay, Soviet Union. Again, it's because it was Soviet republics coming together. Union. The Soviet Union is a lot of times what we call it, but it was also formally known as the USSR. So here, the death of Lenin. Do you remember Lenin? He had the Bolsheviks. He had communism. Okay. So he died in 1924 and Stalin took over. He began to exterminate any Soviet citizen he thought was an enemy. Sad face. That is a terrible, terrible decision. But this was not, unfortunately, uncommon in these sort of totalitarian regimes, was that at any point, if they decided that you were the enemy, it wasn't like you could really easily get a fair trial and say, hey, wait, no, I'm not really on the opposite side. Let me prove it to you. Let you see my records. Let you see, all of my correspondence. I can prove that I am not what you're saying I am. And so because of that, since you did not get that opportunity, these sorts of exterminations, not even trials, notice, we're not using that word, just extermination, put to death. It's a word we use today to talk about like spraying for bugs in our houses, okay? I mean, this is not any sort of fair trial or consideration given. So, this is rough. This is rough. This is part of totalitarianism that a lot of people don't necessarily think about, but it was very, very common at this point. And so Stalin really took it to the next level. All right, and let's also talk about Germany, because Germany, as I'm sure you are aware, also has a very prominent role in World War II. In Germany, the debt from reparation payments for World War I and from having to shut down its military had pretty much brought about an economic collapse and destroyed the nation. Let's stop right there for just a second. Remember, reparation here, that means that to make right. Remember? So they were offering money back to help sort of correct what they had destroyed and to get countries back on their feet that they had, really just torn through during World War I, or that they had divvied up the land. And they were trying to make reparations both financially with money, but also, the boundaries were redrawn after that war. And so it had to give up so much, Germany did, after World War I, that they were in a tremendously terrible state. Economic collapse almost destroyed the nation, okay? So there again, they're looking for, they didn't want the war that was happening. Remember, we talked about in World War I, we were at war with Germany. as far as the government, not with the German people. So the German people were like, look, we need a better situation. We need somebody to help us out of this. We need somebody who can pull the country back together. Okay? And so here comes Adolf Hitler. And now today we think of that name as kind of being synonymous with evil, right? Like we just since we know the end of the story, we think, oh, this guy's like the worst, right? But he came with the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis, because it was Nationalsozialistische, was where that came from, the whole Nazi shortening. And he won the 1932 German elections, okay? And he was appointed a chancellor, okay? And it's not a king exactly, but that is a pretty high up ruler in something that's not a monarchy, something that's more akin to a republic, okay? So, unfortunately, you kind of have to understand at this point, like I said, it's different for us because we know the end of the story, but you have to understand at this point that Hitler looked like the answer to everything, okay? He brought the ideas of his socialist party, of the Nazi party, and he was popular. He was promising to fix things. He was promising to get Germany back on its feet and back to its proud status, back to where it could be proud of who it was as a nation. And so people voted him in. People allowed him to lead them, okay, because he sounded really, really good. Now here, let me put a bracket right here around these two definitions in this last sentence. He promoted the idea of Aryan superiority and gave Germans someone to blame for their problems, the Jewish population. Then Hitler named himself Führer and took control. Okay? So he also, not unlike Mussolini in Italy, but he also named himself the leader. Okay? Der Führer. And he slowly sort of assumed this control. Now here, Aryan here, Northern European heritage, non-Jewish. You also hear it being described as blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, obviously, that was not the only characteristic, and we'll get to this, but you'll hear it described as such, and it was interesting because if you look at any pictures of Hitler, if you find a photo of him, of which there are many, because they had this entire propaganda campaign to support him, but if you find a picture of him, he very much had dark hair and dark eyes. So it was interesting that such ideas were so important to him when clearly they didn't even really correspond to him. All right, so let me adjust this picture so I have plenty of room to write. Okay, so totalitarian expansionism, right? Because if you're going to be the ultimate leader, then you want to be the ultimate leader of as much as you can, right? If you've got a little bit of power, you want more. So each totalitarian leader believed that his country was superior to all others and had the right to conquer, right? That makes sense. If they want control of everything and they get control over one country, why wouldn't they try and have control over two countries or three or more, okay? So here we have stuff happening with Italy and Germany, but we haven't talked about Japan yet, so we're going to start there. All right, 1931. Japan invaded Manchuria, and then in 1937, Japan invaded China, where it perpetrated the Nanjing Massacre, which was a violent attack on the city of Nanjing and its people. And it says here in this little yellow square, oops, I meant to circle it. Here we go. Japan needed colonies with their natural resources to expand. Okay? And this is happening right here. Do you see 1931 and 1937 on the map over here, and then Japan? Okay, so this is when these things are happening over here. Japan, for all of its wonderful fishing and resources, it is still an island nation. So there's only so much that it can actually support. And so when they needed colonies, when they needed natural resources from an area and needed a colony set up to do it, they were well determined that they were going to have a colony set up, whether the people there wanted to be colonized or not. So this is what we see, is that we have them now on the mainland invading other countries, invading China, which is a very large country, and forcibly taking over land and taking over resources. All right, 1935. Italy conquered Ethiopia and left the League of Nations. All right, so 1935, Ethiopia, right there. In 1939, Italy conquered Albania. So you see how they're kind of moving around. Okay, they went all the way down into, because here's Italy right here. They went all the way down into Africa to take a strike at Ethiopia and try and take it over. And then they also went to their neighbor Albania there. Again, because they feel like their power should spread. 1936, Germany annexed the Rhineland. Here's right here. Here is Germany. A coal-rich area that the Treaty of Versailles had declared a neutral buffer zone. And in 1938, Germany conquered Austria. Okay? Now, buffer zone. Here, an area, circling this, an area that has the purpose of keeping two or more other areas distant from one another. Okay, this was supposed to be neutral. Let me underline that up here. This was supposed to be neutral. Nobody was supposed to own this particular stretch of land because it was supposed to, after the Treaty of Versailles, it was supposed to remain neutral so that these boundaries that had been redrawn would not be right up on top of each other all the time, and maybe this would prevent future conflicts. That was the idea. Unfortunately, Germany went in and took it over because they saw, as Japan had seen, resources that they need. In this particular instance, coal. Okay? And this was a resource that they decided they needed, so they went in and they took it over. All right. So, at this point, now we've got three big dictatorships trying to kind of divvy up the world, right? They're kind of trying to all take over before other people take over, and they all want as much as they can. So we've got all three of these big dictatorships moving, okay? Appeasement at Munich. Well, let's talk about an appeasement. Appeasement is a compromise, okay? So if two people, say, are wanting to watch the same television at the same time, but they want to do different activities with it. So maybe somebody wants to watch a movie and somebody wants to play a video game, or maybe you just want to watch two different television shows. Well, you're going to have to come to a compromise, right? You're going to have to figure out a way to share that resource, okay? And so here at Munich, we're talking about a compromise, giving something up. Each side is giving something up in order to maintain the peace. Hitler's next target was the Sudetenland, which is an area of Czechoslovakia. And it had a large German population, okay? So he's thinking, okay, these are my people. I just need to have control over this land as well as the German lands in Austria at this point. Czechoslovakia turned to France and England for help. Czechoslovakia obviously did not necessarily want to be taken over. They had just been established not too long before, and they didn't want to give up that freedom. In September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain proposed that Hitler could have the Sudetenland if, put an if there, big, big underline, if he promised not to invade anywhere else. Question mark? Does that seem like a good plan to you? Because it doesn't seem like a good plan to me. It's like saying, okay, I'll let you take over this one country, but you have to promise to behave. Just doesn't sound like a really good plan. Again, we know the end of the story. At the time, probably seemed perfectly reasonable. So this is what the appeasement was. He was saying, okay, if we give up this part of Czechoslovakia, even though, again, they didn't want to be taken over, if we give this part up, then you just have to promise to behave. You don't invade anywhere else. Because he was trying to prevent another war. So, in March of 1939, Hitler went ahead and conquered Czechoslovakia, and England and France warned that they'd defend Poland, which seemed to be Hitler's next target. So, once he actually took over Czechoslovakia, and they realized that that appeasement was not actually going to work, then England and France got together and said, look, turns out that was a bad plan, and we are definitely going to stand up for Poland. All right. Now, this is where things get tricky. These three countries, these three dictatorships, since they had such similar philosophies, they actually formed their own alliance called the Axis, or the Axis powers. Okay? There's actually a strategy board game that's a lot like Risk that's called Axis and Allies, and it replays these events, these world events. And you kind of get to see different potential outcomes, what could have actually happened, depending on different strategies. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini, so that's Germany and Italy, formed the Rome-Berlin Axis, aka the Axis. Japan joined in 1940. Okay, so Japan was a little behind the other two countries. Stalin, interestingly enough, did not join the Axis, but signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. And so Germany and Russia decided, okay, we're not going to attack each other, but we are going to grab Poland and divvy it up. Okay? And this is another sort of sneaky arrangement, sort of like Germany tried to make with Mexico in the First World War. This is kind of a sneaky deal that they're trying to cut, in order to further their own individual causes. So now here we are again, World War. September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. September 3rd, 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, as promised, okay? So at this point, Britain and France were like, no, see, we already told you, you come after Poland, we're going to declare war on you. We tried to do the appeasement. Clearly you didn't want to honor that, and so now we're at war. World War II had begun officially as of this point, 1939. Here, Hitler used a blitzkrieg, lightning war, which is why this lightning bolt is here, okay? Blitz here is the lightning part, and Krieg is war. And so he was able to conquer Poland because it used speed and surprise both, and bombings and things like that. And this is not the only place he uses this particular tactic. This is, it's just a sudden, really intense attack that people don't know it's coming and therefore are not properly prepared for. And he was able to overwhelm Poland and eventually take it over, despite England and France wanting to be there as backup. Okay, so let's look at this map here. We have all of these arrows here showing direction of spread here. Okay, so how these countries were trying to spread out and take over. So the USSR also attacked Poland and then moved on to the Baltic Peninsula and Finland. Hitler moved north, conquering Denmark and Norway in April 1940, then Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Okay, so you see here, Germany is kind of, hold on, let me get this adjusted. Germany here is kind of spreading out from the middle, whereas the Soviet Union is just spreading further towards the east coast of the Eurasian continent, okay? So, Germany is kind of going all different directions at this point, which is interesting. All this comes into play later, okay? So, now that they've really pushed on all of their neighbors, France was the next big target, which is a big deal because France had, France wasn't one of the allies beforehand. France was against them the first time, and in World War I, I mean, the first time, and France and England had already come together to say, you know, you won't be able to take Poland without a fight. So, France and England are big players in this as far as the Allies go. All right. Allied troops had set up along the Maginot Line at the German border, but they were forced to retreat to Dunkirk, a French town on the English Channel. You guys might remember that name. There was recently a movie released about the events of the battle at Dunkirk. Okay. So, when they retreated to this town, they were trapped as the Germans invaded from the north and Italy attacked from the south. Again, remember, Italy, even though there's no arrows drawn on this map, Italy and Germany are working together. And so they end up being, it's very, very small. Dunkirk is right here. But they end up being attacked from these two different sides, which is very, very complicated, okay? It's very hard to defend on two fronts. And, where am I at? Oh, June 14th, 1940. Let's go to the next page and see if it will load. Because of the way they were pinned down at Dunkirk, the Germans were actually able to seize Paris at this time, and France, unfortunately, surrendered because, again, they were not able to. They didn't really have much of another option at this point because of the way that they were pinned down. So France surrendered on June 22nd, which was a huge hit for the Allies. Put this big star here. Thousands of French and British soldiers at Dunkirk escaped on fishing boats and went to England, where they joined the Free French forces led by General Charles de Gaulle, who ended up being the future president of France. I think that's an interesting little tidbit there. It was far easier to replace military equipment than men, so it was important that they lived to fight another day. That makes sense, right? That you could easily build another gun, but if you had trained people, if you had human lives at stake, they're not easily replaceable. This was a time investment. We're not even talking just about the sanctity of human life here. We're talking about the time, the months invested in training these men to use these weapons and learning battle tactics and things like that. And these were not things that you could just stick together in a factory and ship out to the front lines. So they really did put a premium on saving their own lives to live to fight another day, for more reasons than just the obvious one. Okay? All right. Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Hitler began his air attack on England. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, literally air weapons here, okay, heavily bombed London and other parts of England. Britain, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, refused to surrender. The Royal Air Force, which was the British Air Force here, attacked the Luftwaffe until they retreated. This is also referred to sometimes as the London Blitz. Okay, this is another instance where he used the blitzkrieg tactic. They would come, when they were not expected, they would come under cover of night, and they would drop a bunch of bombs, and they would just be this sudden, intense surprise attack, and then, that it's hard to prepare for that sort of thing. It's hard to prevent. So Hitler, having been made to retreat, at this point, he's like, you know what? I really need to change directions. Okay, so this is not as working as easily for me anymore. I really need to think of a new plan. So he decided he needed the resources and manpower of the Soviet Union, but he did not want to deal with competition from Stalin, right? Because remember, they had already signed a non-competition agreement. Like they were not going to get into a fight. They had already agreed on peace between the two of them, and yet here we go. He decides to attack Russia in June. Oh, non-aggression pact. That was what I was looking for. Non-aggression pact. Okay, so they had already signed this thing, and they had decided that they were not going to be aggressive towards one another. They were going to, Stalin was going to be out of the war, but if he was going to be in the war, he was going to be on Germany's side, so that he would not be a target. And yet, even still, June 1941, he broke that pact. Hitler did, and attacked Russia. The Soviets were forced to retreat, losing thousands of troops who were captured or killed. Stalin, of course, responded to this. He changed course as well. So Stalin joined the Allies. I'm going to circle this whole, well, I'm going to put a box around it. All right, so Stalin joined the Allies and ordered his people to destroy their own resources and burn their own cities before the Germans could get to them. This is the scorched earth tactic. I'm going to underline that again. I know it's in the box, but I'm going to make sure that that's really well underlined, okay? So, at this particular point, when Hitler breaks this pact, Stalin doesn't only fight back, he just completely switches sides. He said, okay, now not only am I not going to hold off, but I'm going to join with the enemy. I am going to, well, with your enemy. I am going to make sure that these other countries, this other alliance beats you, and when you come here to try and take resources and take men and take over this land, we're going to make sure that there is nothing here that you want. So they were burning cities and destroying things and really leaving nothing for Hitler to find. So that was how intense Stalin felt about this particular betrayal. It wasn't just as simple as he retaliated. He was like, no, there will be nothing left for you to even find, since we're now actively working against one another. All right. So, again, this is all pretty much just happening in Europe at this point. Okay? Here, let's talk about this blue box here. A lot of children were evacuated from London during the bombings. This event even appears in the Chronicles of Narnia books. The main characters are sent away to live in the English countryside. Okay, and this was not uncommon at this point, that if they were living in the cities which were being targeted, for these blitzkrieg bombings, it was not uncommon for mom or dad or whoever to send children out to lower density populated areas, or entire other countries to go stay with relatives, even distant relatives. It was not uncommon for them to be sent away to reduce the chance of them being caught in a bombing or anything. I mean, this was a terrible, terrible time. And these children, when they were sent, they were basically put on, well, and some of them were, they were basically mailed, if I can explain it that way. Now, I don't mean that they were put into like a box and sealed up or put in an envelope. I mean that they had a tag, they packed up all of their stuff, they had a tag tied to their jacket with an address on it, and they were transported by the mail system a lot of times, especially if they were very young. And toddlers were sent this way. It's just a very, very scary time. Parents were trying to do anything and everything that they could to keep their children from falling prey to the violence of the war. Okay, so all of this is happening, and the U.S. is really trying to stay neutral, okay? Because again, after World War I, we're still doing our own recovery, okay? Between 1935 and 1937, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, making it illegal for Americans to sell weapons or loan money to foreign nations. When FDR was elected for a third term, and this here, I'm going to put a star by it, this is the first time anybody had served more than 2 terms. In 1940, he knew the nation was on the brink of war. So this 1940, that was his third election that he won. Congress had expanded the American military at FDR's request, and in 1940, it passed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. Okay, peacetime meaning that we were not currently at war, but FDR saw that it was coming, so he was using this quote peacetime draft to sort of prepare. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease Act made it legal to sell or lend weapons and supplies to the Allies. Okay, so not to support, let's see here, foreign nations here, but to the Allies. That was a different thing. Okay, so the Lend-Lease Act sort of worked its way around the Neutrality Act, saying, well, it's not that we can't support any foreign nations, it's just that we can only support the Allies. That August 1941, after German attacks on American destroyers, FDR and Churchill issued the Atlantic Charter. Okay, so again, we're sort of brought into this almost accidentally at first. Okay, we're trying to give supplies, and our American destroyers, our parts of our Navy, are attacked by Germans because we're trying to help their enemies. So when we have the Atlantic Charter here, it stated that neither country had any territorial ambitions in the war, and that all people had the right to determine and live under a government of their own choosing. Okay? Again, emphasizing freedom. You know how much we love emphasizing freedom, fighting for other people to have freedom, protecting freedom. America, at this point, super about freedom. Okay? So, we're basically talking, FDR is talking to Churchill, who is leading Britain at this point. Again, France has had to surrender. France has had to back down. And so here we are, we're both in it, and we're just saying, hey, we're not fighting this war to take over any of this land. We're fighting the war only for freedom. So let's talk about Pearl Harbor. That's another movie that's been made. I don't know if you guys have any frame of reference for that. And also, it should be noted, I'm not recommending any of these movies to you guys if your parents would not be okay with you watching it. Okay, so don't try to blame this on me. Well, Miss Brooke said, no, Miss Brooke did not say. Miss Brooke is just reminding you that these sorts of events are covered in the mainstream media right now. And so if it were okay with your parental units or guardian angels, that might be something that you would be interested to look at whenever it was deemed appropriate. Okay, so don't try to get me in trouble. All right, so Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, in Japan, Hideki Tojo, a military leader, was elected prime minister in 1941. Tojo became a dictator and soon had more influence than even the emperor of Japan. Okay, so again, here is that dictatorship that's really surfacing in Japan, and that makes it, the third part of this axis. And so he even gets to where he has more power than the emperor. He has the successful invasions in Asia. And so Tojo set his sights on islands like the Philippines. Okay. And the Philippines here. Okay. Well, hold on. The Philippines are covered up on this map. Okay. So we talked about this. We talked about the importance of Hawaii going from uh, the western coast of the United States across over into these Asian countries over here. So then you see it's blown up right here. It's Hawaiian Islands, and they look like that. And then Oahu, that island, is what contains Pearl Harbor, which is right here. Okay? So Tojo thinks, okay, we need to destroy the American Navy. They're the ones currently using Hawaii as a stopping point in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And so if we can take out the Navy, then we'll have a better shot at taking these lands over for ourselves. So December 7th, 1941, the day President Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. Japan launched a surprise attack on the naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a devastating attack that sunk or heavily damaged 8 U.S. battleships along with 3 cruisers and several other ships. A total of 2,403 American civilians and servicemen were killed, and 1,178 on top of that were wounded. The only thing that spared even more U.S. lives was the fact that the U.S. carrier fleet was not in port currently. It was not sitting at Pearl Harbor and therefore was undamaged. And the crew of those vessels were able to escape injury. The very next day, this was another sort of surprise attack. This was not exactly like the Blitzkrieg, but this was Japan's version of that tactic. The next day, FDR asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The 3 days later, okay, right here, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. So Congress declared war back. Okay, so now we are fully invested in this. We were losing ships to Germany in the Atlantic, but then we were also attacked on our own home soil by the Japanese, and that was it. That was all. That was all she wrote. We were now officially neck deep in the war. So let's talk about mobilization on the home front. What did we do to sort of get things together to fight this war and to move resources around and stuff like that? Well, industries that were, in production, factories that already existed, they began to make tanks, ammunition, and other war-related products under the direction of the government. Okay? And put a star right here. All of that work, since now we had a higher demand for these specific wartime products, therefore jobs were being created, and soldiers again were going back to their wartime duties, and civilians were able to step up and take back over these factory jobs, these production jobs. All of this work, all of this shifting to mobilize to support the war effort ended the Great Depression, creating an employment rate of almost 100%. That means almost 100% of everybody who was of age and eligible to have a job did in fact have a job. And also, of course, there were new government agencies, just like in World War I. Okay? The War Production Board decided which goods factories would produce. Americans were encouraged to ration food and grow victory gardens. Okay, so here, victory gardens, that was a little bit of psychology. The people were encouraged to, whenever possible, if they had land that could sustain growing like a small personal crop of vegetables, so that they could grow their own food instead of relying on markets and farmers, so that that food could go to the front lines. They were encouraged to do this. So this victory garden idea is like, if you can grow your own food, that will help us have victory in this war. And then rationing here, you've probably heard this word before, control of how much of something is available to each individual in a group. Okay, so it would be like if, say, we were in class and I was handing out bags of chips or a drink, and I would say, okay, now everybody just take one. Okay, or pieces of candy. You can have 3 pieces of candy out of this bucket or something like that. That's rationing, but this was obviously much more extreme than just that. This was how much milk could you buy at any given time, or within a week's time, or within a month's time. This was very, very strict rationing. But again, it was an attempt to support the war effort and make sure that there was enough being produced by the country to go to the troops that were defending our country, as well as have people at home be taken care of at least marginally. Okay, we were making sacrifices to provide for the troops that were defending our way of life. The Office of Price Administration controlled inflation. Made sure that there were not any sort of like price gouging, weird, shady stuff going on. The National War Labor Board resolved labor conflicts. We talked about that before. Making sure that workers were being heard and taken care of, but were also able to still do what needed doing. The Revenue Act of 1942 raised taxes, and the government also raised money by selling war bonds. Okay, again, these have also been called Liberty bonds. Okay, so the idea of all this, now a bond is like a piece of paper that you say that a bond was $5 at this point. So you would give the government $5, and when you would receive this paper, and it would say that, okay, this is worth $5 from the government. I believe, including interest, there was supposed to be an interest rate of growth at some point on these as well. And the idea again being that if you could sacrifice, if you could give extra money towards the war effort, that it would bring liberty and victory and freedom. We really loved those words at this particular point. Let's talk about opportunities and discrimination. Okay, there were some tremendous opportunities that actually came around because of this. Posters of Rosie the Riveter were used to encourage women to work in factories and the defense industry. This was a big deal because when the men went to war, I'll write this here, men, arrow, war, the women went to work. Okay, I'm sure you guys know what a rivet is, right? It's this metal fastener, and you use these very large, I believe, pneumatic guns, so they're powered by air, to hold sheets of metal together. Sheets of metal that would make, say, airplanes and tanks and battleships. Okay, so these were not delicate sewing jobs like we had talked about before, where women had a resurgence of job opportunities We're talking about actual construction work and work that was directly shipped out to the guys on the front lines. Okay, so we're talking about actually putting things together that were equipment for the war effort, and so this made a very positive sort of um, it's made for a very positive sort of piece of propaganda. The whole Rosie the Riveter idea, that women could directly now support the war effort, and it didn't have to be an indirect or women's work kind of thing. It was very attractive to a lot of women at this time. Women enlisted in high numbers as WACs, Women's Army Corps, WAVES, women appointed for volunteer emergency service in the Navy, or WASPs, Women's Air Force Service pilots, but as non-combatants. Okay, so these were not, okay, so let's see, so this is the Army and the Air Force. These were not combat positions within the military, but they were as close as women could get at this particular point. And this was also a huge deal that now we actually technically have women working in military positions. I mean, this is a very, very big deal here. Threats by Black labor leader A. Philip Randolph to protest in Washington, D.C. led Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Act, prohibiting discrimination in factories supplying the war effort. Okay? Prohibiting discrimination in factories supplying the war effort. At this particular point, we needed all hands on deck. We needed every single able-bodied American, black, white, purple, didn't matter. We needed every single able-bodied American working to support the war effort. And unfortunately, in some places, companies and factories, they didn't get the memo. So Roosevelt signs this order, Executive Order 8802, and he prohibits discrimination. He's like, no, if there's an able-bodied American willing to work for the war effort, you've got to accept them. Okay? African Americans worked in defense factories in the North. Army units were segregated at the beginning of the war, but there was integration over the course of the fighting. Famous black units included the Tuskegee Airmen. And if you're thinking Tuskegee sounds familiar, it's because it is here in Alabama. All right, so we are part of this in kind of a cool way. All right. Native Americans also fought, and they also created unbreakable secret codes based on the Navajo language. I do believe that we are going to get to the code talkers here in a little bit, but this is what we're talking about. There was a movie about these guys as well recently. The government recruited Mexican American laborers called braceros to work in agriculture. Okay, so again, we're taking advantage of these natural skill sets. We're trying to involve immigrants and minorities and things like that. And this is going to support our own American brand of nationalism and stuff like that. But it's not all peaches and cream, right? It's not all roses and rainbows. On the flip side, women were still paid much less than men, right? The women were not seen as valuable, equally valuable. So that's terrible. That's terrible. Greater African American and Mexican American presence in cities, right, because they're coming in to do work for the war effort, led to tension and riots, including the 1943 Zoot Suit riots in LA, so-called after the clothing style worn by many young Latino men at the time, and minorities were paid less than white workers. Okay, that's another frowny face. And these riots here, this was people were scared of anything different. And unfortunately, we're just going to see this get a little bit worse as the war drags on. So we're not going to talk about that right this second, but we will get there. All right. So, as a matter of fact, here we are. We are there. Okay, so at this point we have been attacked specifically by the Japanese. Okay, and there had also already been a large immigration of Japanese people. So we have immigrants, Issei, and Americans, American-born people of Japanese descent. Okay, so where it's so like if somebody immigrated here and then had a child on American soil, that would be Nisei. Okay, and they faced some really specific discrimination because, unfortunately, of because of their heritage. Now, it didn't matter that they had nothing to do with the Japanese army bombing us. Again, this is discrimination just because they were different from us and because they looked like the enemy, regardless of whether they had any actual animosity or enemy ties or not. Even people born in the U.S. were suspected of being spies. In February 1942, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, forcing Japanese Americans to leave their homes and move to internment camps. In 1944, 2 years later, in the case of Korematsu versus United States, the Supreme Court upheld this as necessary. Okay? In 1942, when this starts happening, the 442 Regimental Combat Team was created and composed of Japanese Americans. They served heroically during the war in Europe, but were not allowed to fight in the Pacific. I'm sure that there were many people with concerns about them changing sides, or maybe being discovered as being double agents. And then here, over 40 years later, so in the 80s, Congress admitted that the internment had been wrong and made a formal apology. But yeah, so basically anybody that looked like the enemy was sent to these internment camps, and these were not hotels and spas and nice things. This is not what they did. So this is not a great decision on the part of the American government, and part of the reason why this was not a super awesome decision and not viewed fondly was because of what was happening in a similar time frame over in Europe, which we will get to, I believe, next time. So, all right, this has been long enough. I will let you guys go. If you notice, I have still some questions here. They should be dropping one or two at a time. And so just look for those and answer those questions on Google Classroom, okay? All right, I'll see y'all later, and I hope you have a great and wonderful day.